young girl runs to her neighbor, sobbing uncontrollably, crying out, "He acts like P. Diddy. What happens next will shock you." Behind closed doors, a father is spiraling and a daughter is being pushed to the edge. Can a broken family be saved, or is it too late? Stay with us as we uncover the truth, unravel the secrets, and witness an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, pride, and redemption. Before we jump into this heart-wrenching journey, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from today. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will stick with you long after the screen fades to black. The neighborhood was like many others that dotted the edges of a quiet town, tucked away just far enough from the bustle of the city but close enough to hear the echoes of its activity. This suburban street was lined with modest homes, brick houses with manicured lawns and little gardens bursting with color. The houses were arranged in neat rows, their white picket fences a nod to the idealized life most people strived for. It was a community where everyone knew each other, waved on their daily walks, and exchanged pleasantries by the mailboxes. At the end of the street, past the playground where children played soccer or raced on their bikes, was a house that had once been full of warmth and laughter. It was the home of Daniel and his daughter Lily. Lily had always been a bright spark in the neighborhood, the kind of child whose energy and curiosity were infectious. Her laugh would fill the street when she played with her friends in the yard, her imagination always taking her to new worlds. She had a natural gift for art, creating colorful drawings that she proudly hung up on her bedroom walls. Her teachers often commented on her talent, praising her for her creativity and her ability to think outside the box. To the neighbors, Lily was the embodiment of childhood joy, always running, always exploring, always asking questions. But something had changed. Lily's world had grown quiet. Her once bright eyes were duller now, and her smile, once so full of life, had become rare, as if she had forgotten how to smile in the way she used to. She wasn't the same Lily that the neighbors had known. The vibrant girl who used to skip down the sidewalk, her hands full of art supplies or books, was gone. She still went to school, still did her homework, still came home to the house at the end of the street, but when she walked through the door, it felt like she was walking into a different world, a world where the laughter of her childhood was swallowed up by silence. Her room, once a haven of creativity, had become a sanctuary of isolation. The walls that used to be covered in colorful drawings now only had a few half-finished sketches pinned up, their bright colors muted, the images now darker and more somber. The cheerful clutter of toys and books had been replaced with an eerie tidiness. Lily no longer ran to her father's arms when he got home from work. Instead, she quietly withdrew into her room, the door closing softly behind her. She no longer told her father about her day at school or shared the exciting little things that happened in her life. Instead, she kept everything to herself. Her friends had begun to notice, and though they still reached out to her occasionally, Lily had started to distance herself from them. She wasn't sure why. She only knew that it was easier to be alone. Daniel had once been the person who filled every room with energy. He had an undeniable presence. In the early days, he was a man of ambition, a go-getter with a dream. He had started his own tech company at the age of 29, believing in the potential of his ideas, his ability to innovate. He had invested everything into it, his time, his money, and his heart. He would stay late into the night, sketching ideas, developing strategies, pitching to investors. He had the energy of someone who was determined to succeed. The company had taken off at first. The business was located in the heart of the city, a small but promising startup that had begun to attract attention. Daniel's name became known in certain circles. He was the young entrepreneur with a bright future. His company designed cutting-edge software for small businesses, streamlining operations with an efficiency that caught the eye of major investors. He could see the finish line, and he was running toward it. But the finish line never came. Over time, the pressure mounted. What seemed like a series of promising partnerships turned into failed ventures. One investor pulled out, then another, and soon Daniel's company was drowning in debt. He refused to face it at first. His pride wouldn't let him. He kept throwing himself into work, putting on the facade that everything was fine. But inside, he knew things were falling apart. The final blow came when a major client backed out of a multi-million-dollar contract, and Daniel's company was unable to recover. He tried to salvage it, but it was too late. The debts, the pressure, the constant calls from creditors, it all became too much for him to bear. His company folded, and with it, so did his sense of self-worth. Daniel's pride and determination to keep up appearances had led him into an emotional collapse. No longer the man who had dreams of a successful future, he became withdrawn, disconnected and bitter. It wasn't just the loss of his business, it was the loss of himself. At first Daniel tried to push through. He told himself that everything would be fine, that things would eventually turn around. But they didn't. Slowly Daniel stopped leaving the house. His former charisma became a distant memory, replaced by long, silent nights where he sat in the dark, drinking his troubles away. He had no answers, no direction, and no one to turn to. His relationship with Lily, once full of love and laughter, had become strained. The man who had once been full of promises for his daughter now seemed like a shadow of that person. Lily, confused and scared, tried to reach out, but Daniel was unreachable. The more Lily sought attention, the more distant he became. His silence was deafening, and Lily, unsure of how to fix the world around her, simply retreated into herself. Lily's mother had been absent from the picture for years. It was never a topic that Daniel discussed openly, and Lily had grown up without ever fully understanding what had happened. There were scattered memories, an image of her mother smiling, a voice calling her name, but those memories were clouded, faded, like old photographs left in the sun too long. From what Lily had gathered, her mother had left when she was very young. Daniel had never spoken about it much, and Lily had never pressed him for details. But there were moments when she would catch him staring off into the distance, his face clouded with sorrow. There was a day, long before the darkness settled in their home, when Daniel had tried to explain things to Lily in his own way. "Sometimes people just change, kiddo," he had said. "They leave, and we have to deal with it the best we can." It was a simple explanation, one that Lily didn't fully understand at the time, but as she grew older she began to piece things together. It wasn't the easiest conclusion to reach, but she realized that her mother's departure was the event that had set the chain of events in motion. It was the first crack in the foundation of their family. Lily often wondered if things would have been different if her mother had stayed. Mrs. Thompson had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, and in all that time she had watched families come and go. She knew what a healthy family looked like, and she knew what it looked like when something wasn't quite right. She had always kept a watchful eye on Lily. The little girl had been full of life when she was younger, always running around, chatting with the neighbors, her energy contagious. But recently Mrs. Thompson had noticed the changes. Lily didn't play outside anymore. She didn't stop by to chat, and when she did, it was always in a hurry, her head down, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Thompson knew something was wrong. She had been a teacher for years and had learned to recognize the signs of children in distress. She had seen it with other students over the years, children whose homes weren't as stable as they should have been. She had seen how the weight of emotional neglect could show up in subtle ways: low grades, withdrawn behavior, lack of enthusiasm. And Lily's changes were unmistakable. Something was wrong in that house, and Mrs. Thompson was determined to find out what. The neighborhood around Lily's house was always quiet. It was a place where everyone knew each other, but at the same time, no one really asked too many questions. People lived their lives, and as long as things seemed normal, no one probed too deeply into their neighbor's business. But the cracks were starting to show. A few neighbors had begun to notice Lily walking alone, her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast. Her once bright face had lost its glow. The children who used to play with her began to see less of her. But no one really asked why. Mrs. Thompson couldn't sit back and do nothing. She'd seen it before, and she knew that if she didn't act now, the damage might be too great. Lily was too young to carry the weight of whatever was happening at home by herself. The house had been tense for hours before Lily finally couldn't take it anymore. It had started like it always did, a minor disagreement, a sharp word from Daniel, and then the escalation. She had asked him if he was going to make dinner, but instead of the usual distracted acknowledgement, Daniel had snapped. His frustration over his own failed dreams, compounded by his inability to fix the house or himself, erupted. His words were harsh, his tone unforgiving, and Lily felt the sting of his anger deep inside her. "Why can't you just leave me alone for once?" Daniel had shouted, throwing his hands up in defeat. Lily, her hands trembling, tried to explain that she didn't mean to interrupt, but his anger was like a storm swirling around them both, and she couldn't get away from it. She had been trying desperately to get his attention in any way she could, trying to help, trying to reach him, but it always ended in silence or coldness. This time, though, was different. This time, the frustration inside her, the hurt, the confusion, all of it came to a head. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood frozen in the doorway. She could feel the sharpness of his words deep in her chest, and it felt like she was being suffocated by it all. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't the enemy, but she couldn't find her voice. So instead, Lily did what she had learned to do when things felt too overwhelming. She ran. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and bolted out the door. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to escape. The cold wind bit at her skin as she ran down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. The streets that had once been full of laughter and joy felt empty, like the world had turned against her. Her small feet slapped the pavement as she ran faster, not looking back. She didn't know how long it took to reach Mrs. Thompson's house, but when she finally arrived, her breath came out in ragged gasps. The tears had already begun to streak her face, and she couldn't stop them now. She stumbled up the steps, fumbling with the doorbell, desperate for someone to listen. The moment the door swung open, Mrs. Thompson saw the panic in Lily's eyes. It was a look she knew all too well. Mrs. Thompson had seen that same expression on countless students over the years, the look of someone who was trying to keep it together, but had reached the breaking point. Lily didn't wait for Mrs. Thompson to speak. She just collapsed into her arms, the sobs coming in ragged, uncontrollable waves. She didn't have the words to explain, but she didn't need them. Mrs. Thompson could feel the weight of the pain, the urgency in Lily's body as she trembled against her. "Acts like P. Diddy," Lily cried out between sobs, the words escaping her in a rush, almost as though she had been holding them in for far too long. Mrs. Thompson, though trying to comfort her, was taken aback by the comparison. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, guiding Lily inside, taking her coat off as she led her to the couch. The warmth of the house, the smell of freshly brewed tea, the gentle sound of the ticking clock on the wall. It all felt so different from the chaos Lily had just escaped. Lily shook her head, struggling to catch her breath. He's always angry. He never listens. He only thinks about himself. He just doesn't care. He's like someone who doesn't care about anything but himself, like a big celebrity who's too good for everyone else. I don't know what happened to him, but I miss him. I miss my dad." Mrs. Thompson sat down beside Lily, her hand on the young girl's back, rubbing soothing circles. It was then that she realized just how serious this was. Lily was always such a bright, outgoing girl, no longer the cheerful child she used to be. And now, with her heart laid bare in front of Mrs. Thompson, it became clear something was deeply wrong with the way Daniel was treating his daughter, and Mrs. Thompson had to understand it better, if only to help. Mrs. Thompson sat back, letting Lily take a moment to compose herself, though her mind was racing. Lily's words, the comparison to Diddy, stayed with her, and she kept replaying them in her mind. Daniel had always been a bit proud, a bit distant at times, but never cruel. Or at least, not in this way. She had seen him around town, the brief conversations they'd shared, always the charming businessman who'd once been full of energy and ideas. But Mrs. Thompson hadn't seen him lately, not truly. Lily's comparison was not something Mrs. Thompson could ignore. She'd seen the way Daniel used to engage with people, charming and full of life, always able to turn a conversation or make a joke. But now, from what Lily was telling her, that man was gone, replaced by someone bitter, emotionally closed off, and unreachable. It was hard for Mrs. Thompson to fathom at first. She had always known Daniel as someone full of potential, even though he had been secretive about certain things, his rise and fall, his business troubles. They had been whispers in the neighborhood, but no one really knew the full story. But now, hearing Lily's words, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel that there was more going on here than simple financial problems. She had to act. Lily couldn't be left to suffer like this. No child should be forced to carry the emotional burden of a broken home, especially not in silence. "Lily," Mrs. Thompson said softly, brushing a stray hair from the girl's face, "you're not alone in this. We'll figure this out, I promise." Her voice was steady, full of warmth, but also something else, a quiet resolve. She knew that Lily's pain ran deeper than she could immediately fix, but Mrs. Thompson also knew this. She could not stand by and watch a child suffer in silence. Once Lily had calmed down and was resting on the couch with a blanket draped around her, Mrs. Thompson made a mental note. She needed to keep a closer eye on Daniel, to find out exactly what had been happening behind the scenes. She knew she couldn't help Lily alone. She had to make sure Daniel understood the gravity of the situation too. He had to be reached, somehow. She had been a teacher for decades, and though she wasn't a therapist or a counselor, she knew a thing or two about how difficult it could be for someone to ask for help. Daniel's pride was obvious. He had built his business from the ground up, and his failure had surely wounded him deeply. But that did not excuse the way he was treating his daughter. Mrs. Thompson had always believed in the importance of community, of stepping in when necessary, and she was ready to take that step now. She resolved to visit Daniel the next day. She would not be confrontational, but she had to approach him with the kind of gentle but firm understanding that only someone who had been through difficult times could offer. It wasn't just Lily's well-being that mattered now, it was his too. Daniel had to realize that no one could carry the weight of the world on their own. No one. Mrs. Thompson knew it wouldn't be easy, and there was no guarantee that Daniel would open up, but she also knew that if anyone had the ability to break through to him, it was her. She had seen enough hurt over the years to recognize the signs, and if she was going to help Lily, she had to start with Daniel. As Mrs. Thompson got up from the couch, her mind already formulating her next move, she glanced back at Lily, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. She walked over and gently kissed the top of the girl's head. "I'll make sure you don't go through this alone," she whispered, a promise she meant to keep. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but keep a watchful eye on the house next door. Her window gave her an unobstructed view of the front yard, and every so often she'd glance over at Daniel's house. She knew she couldn't force her way in or press Lily to talk. There had to be another way. As days went by, Mrs. Thompson became more and more concerned. There was something off about the way Daniel was behaving. When he first moved into the neighborhood years ago, Daniel had been the life of the block. He used to come out to say hello to neighbors, chatting with ease, always offering advice or lending a hand. But now, the house was quieter than ever. Mrs. Thompson noticed that he hardly left anymore, spending more time alone in his study. Sometimes he would sit by the window, his face drawn, staring out at the yard, looking as though he was seeing something no one else could. At other times he paced back and forth in front of the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. It was a nervous energy, a restlessness that seemed to grow as each day passed. Whenever he did leave the house, it was brief. A quick trip to the store or a walk around the block, always alone. And when he returned, it was as if the world outside had little to offer him. Mrs. Thompson had caught sight of him a few times in the early evenings, sitting alone on the porch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. The clinking of the bottle's cap was faint, but it cut through the silence that had become so familiar in that house. The interaction he had with Lily, when it occurred, was strained at best. Mrs. Thompson had seen them a few times through the window. There was no laughter, no meaningful conversation. Just a cold exchange of words, too quick, too sharp. When Lily tried to engage him, she would receive only brief, distracted responses, her father's eyes never fully meeting hers. She'd retreat quickly, either heading straight to her room or to the backyard to be alone. It was clear to Mrs. Thompson that something was broken between them. The warmth that used to radiate from Daniel when he looked at his daughter, when he would lift her up on his shoulders or laugh at the silly things she did, was now gone. The bond that had once been the center of their world had turned cold. And Lily seemed to be the only one who noticed. It wasn't just Mrs. Thompson who had started to notice. The entire neighborhood was beginning to sense that something was off in that house. At first it was little things. Lily walking alone down the street to school when she had always been picked up before. She'd used to wait for Daniel to drive her, and the sight of father and daughter together had been an everyday occurrence. But now, the sight of her walking alone had become too regular. Lily had always been an active child, her face always lighting up when she saw a friend. But now, the few times she walked past other kids, she walked with her head down, her eyes avoiding contact. Her friends, once eager to spend time with her, started to look at each other in confusion. No one could quite put their finger on it, but something had changed. Mrs. Thompson had noticed how Lily seemed to be doing more for herself. The child who had once relied on her father for even the smallest things was suddenly taking care of things alone. There were days when Lily prepared her own meals, making peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup with an expertise far beyond her age. She would take the trash out herself, sweep the floor, and even tended to the small garden Daniel had once been proud of. It was as if she was trying to take the place of the parent Daniel had stopped being. And then there was the bruise. It had been a late afternoon when Mrs. Thompson saw Lily coming back from the backyard, her hand clutching her side. At first, Mrs. Thompson assumed the girl had just fallen while playing, but the way she quickly adjusted her sweater made Mrs. Thompson pause. The bruise was fresh, dark against Lily's pale skin. It looked like it had been hidden on purpose. When Mrs. Thompson tried to approach her, Lily quickly withdrew, offering a faint smile but not meeting her gaze. "What happened, dear?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently, her concern deepening. Lily shifted uncomfortably. I tripped. It's nothing." Mrs. Thompson's heart sank, but she didn't push. She couldn't. She had already crossed a line by watching from the window, but this was different. This wasn't just about what she saw. It was about what she knew, what Lily was silently telling her. Weeks passed, and Mrs. Thompson's worry grew. She couldn't stop thinking about Lily's bruise, the way Daniel had started to drift further away from his daughter, and the isolation that was taking over the household. There was only one person she could think of who might make a difference: Daniel's brother, Richard. Richard had never really fit in with the family dynamic. He had his own problems, his own struggles. He and Daniel hadn't spoken much over the years, especially after Richard had gone through his own battles with addiction and a few failed attempts at mending his life. But he had always cared about Lily. Even after he and Daniel stopped talking, Richard had occasionally visited the house, asking how Lily was, how she was doing. But Daniel had always pushed him away, too proud to accept any help, too angry to listen. Richard's return to the neighborhood was an unexpected turn. It had nothing to do with Daniel's situation. It was a family emergency, the passing of a distant relative. Richard arrived with a heavy heart and a suitcase filled with unfinished business. He hadn't been in town for over a year, and the last time he and Daniel had spoken, it hadn't ended well. Despite the awkwardness that hung in the air between them, Richard couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation with Lily. He had always loved her like a daughter. When he first walked into the house, he was struck by how different it felt. Darker, emptier. The absence of joy was palpable, and Lily seemed to shrink further into herself the longer he stayed. She wouldn't look at him directly, and her answers to his questions were short. One evening, as Richard sat in the living room, nursing a beer, Daniel joined him. They sat in silence for a while, the awkwardness thick between them. "How's she doing?" Richard asked, his voice quiet but pointed. Daniel avoided his brother's gaze. "She's fine. She's just been quiet lately." Richard didn't believe him. He could see the way Daniel avoided his questions, the way he seemed unwilling to even talk about Lily. The tension in the air was undeniable. Daniel had retreated into his own world, and Richard's attempt to break through was like hitting a wall. His pride was too strong, his defenses too high. "I think she needs help, Dan," Richard said, his voice soft but firm. "Don't start with me, Richard," Daniel snapped, his eyes finally meeting his brother's. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've got it under control." But Richard knew. He had seen this before. He had tried to help, tried to be there for Daniel, but the pride had always been too much. It was the same reason they hadn't spoken for months. The same reason Daniel had isolated himself from everyone who cared. Richard's presence only added complexity to the situation. Though his intentions were to help, his return made Daniel even more defensive, more closed off. The tension between the brothers was palpable, and it didn't make anything easier. But Richard didn't give up. He was determined to get through to his brother, and in his own way he was trying to force Daniel to face what was happening, even if Daniel didn't want to acknowledge it. The shift in Daniel's demeanor was almost too jarring to comprehend. It was hard to believe that the man who now paced the house, his eyes hollow and distant, was once the vibrant, charismatic person everyone knew. His past seemed like another life, one filled with possibilities and dreams. It was almost as if the man who used to be full of life had disappeared, replaced by a hollow shell who couldn't find his way back. In flashes, Daniel could remember the good times, when he was full of ambition, when his company had been thriving, when he'd been a constant presence in Lily's life. He could see himself at family gatherings, laughing with friends, proudly showing off his work, and always holding Lily close. She had been the center of his world. He remembered coming home late from work and finding her still awake, eyes bright with excitement, waiting to tell him about her day. He had been so proud of her. And in those moments, he had been proud of himself, too. His success had felt like a validation of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed. He had promised himself that he would give her everything that he never had, and for a while he had. He'd been the father who took her to soccer games, the one who helped with her homework, the one who made sure she always had the best of everything. But as the days blurred together, the images of the past seemed to lose their warmth. His mind would wander back to those moments, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. He could see himself walking through the doors of his old office, feeling like a king. the crisp smell of new contracts, the sound of excited employees, the satisfaction of closing deals that pushed his business to new heights. It had been the dream. But then the dream had crumbled. It had all unraveled so fast. The bright future he had seen for himself and Lily slipped through his fingers in a way that felt like a cruel joke. Every day he found himself haunted by the idea that he wasn't enough. His once warm and confident smile had been replaced by a constant scowl, his eyes never meeting anyone else's, least of all Lily's. His shame weighed on him like a blanket he couldn't shake off. The man who had once promised to be there for his daughter, to be her protector, her guide, was now a stranger in his own home. Daniel had learned to wear his shame like a second skin. No one could see it, not at first. He'd become a master of hiding it behind a smile, behind a facade of normalcy. To the outside world, he was just another man going through a rough patch. But inside, he was drowning. The guilt gnawed at him every day. Guilt for failing Lily, for not being the father he had promised to be. The guilt came in waves, swallowing him whole when he was alone. He couldn't even look Lily in the eye anymore. She was the constant reminder of everything he had lost, and yet, she was also the reason he couldn't bring himself to give up. There were moments when he would catch her looking at him with those wide eyes, the ones that used to be full of love and trust, but now, there was something else in them. A mixture of fear, confusion, and sadness that Daniel couldn't bear to face. He was too ashamed to face her, too ashamed to admit that he couldn't fix things. His pride had always been a double-edged sword. It had fueled his ambition, his success, but now it was the very thing keeping him from reaching out. He couldn't ask for help, couldn't admit that he was failing. His pride told him that to do so would be a sign of weakness. But that same pride had created a barrier between him and the daughter he loved. Instead of asking for help, Daniel turned to unhealthy coping mechanisms. He started drinking more. Small, inconspicuous sips at first, but soon he found himself unable to stop. It wasn't the alcohol that helped him forget. It was the numbness that came with it. He wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't making rational decisions. The moments when he felt most vulnerable, when his shame threatened to overtake him, were the moments he craved that escape. But as he drank more, he withdrew further. He became unreachable, not just physically, but emotionally. The walls he had built around himself became thicker. The distance between him and Lily grew wider with every passing day. At some point, Daniel began to wonder if he was even capable of being the father Lily needed. Could he fix this? Could he ever be the man she deserved? Every time he tried to answer those questions, the answers seemed to disappear, swallowed by the dark hole he had dug for himself. The weight of the situation had been pressing down on Mrs. Thompson for days, even weeks. The more she watched, the more she observed Daniel's gradual collapse, the more she understood that the only way forward was to confront him. But she knew it had to be done carefully. She had to tread lightly, especially given Daniel's pride and emotional distance. He wasn't a man who welcomed help. Not now, not after everything he'd been through. Mrs. Thompson had been patient, observing the little signs that spoke volumes. Lily's withdrawal, Daniel's emotional distance, the alcohol bottles that were now a fixture in the house. But something in her had shifted. She couldn't stand by and watch Lily suffer any longer. Her instincts told her that Daniel's decline wasn't just a result of his financial struggles. It was something deeper, something that needed to be addressed before it destroyed what little remained of his relationship with his daughter. She had spent hours mulling over how to approach him. She had decided that she couldn't wait any longer, that the time had come to make her move. She wasn't an expert, but she had enough life experience to know when someone was sinking, and Daniel was sinking fast. One afternoon, when she saw Daniel out in the yard fumbling with the garden hose, she knew the moment had arrived. She walked across the street to his house, her steps deliberate but calm. She wasn't angry, she wasn't here to accuse him. She was here because she saw the pain behind his eyes, because she saw what his daughter needed, and because, in some small way, she had to believe that there was still a chance for Daniel to pull himself out of this. "Daniel," she called out gently, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." Daniel paused, looking up at her with a mixture of surprise and unease. He hadn't been expecting this, but Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to give him the luxury of avoidance anymore. He put the hose down slowly, but instead of making eye contact, he stared at the ground. "What is it, Mrs. Thompson?" His voice was strained, as though every word was too much to speak. She took a deep breath, walking up to him with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the air. "I've been watching you, Daniel," she began, "and I've seen how things have changed. how distant you've become. Your daughter, she's hurting, and you're not the man she needs right now." Daniel's expression darkened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "You've been watching me?" His voice was tight, and there was an edge to it. He wasn't used to people poking around in his life like this, especially not someone like Mrs. Thompson, who had always kept to herself. He felt exposed, defensive. "I'm just concerned," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "Lily needs you, Daniel. You're not just failing as a father, you're failing her, and I think you know that." Daniel flinched, as if the words physically hurt. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he stood there, his hands clenching at his sides, trying to control the rising tide of frustration that always came when he was confronted. "You don't know what it's like," Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice laced with bitterness. "You don't understand what I'm going through." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened and she stepped closer to him, her voice steady. "I may not know exactly what you're feeling, Daniel, but I can see what it's doing to you, and I see what it's doing to her." Daniel looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground, a deep sense of guilt pressing on him. He wanted to lash out, to tell Mrs. Thompson to mind her own business, to retreat into his cocoon of pride and self-loathing. But a part of him, the part he had buried for so long, knew she was right. He had no idea how to fix things, how to make them right again. At first Daniel recoiled from Mrs. Thompson's words. It was as if she had cracked open something that he had tried to bury deep inside himself, something he wasn't ready to face, something too painful to confront. His first instinct was to shut her down, to push her away like he had done with everyone else. But he couldn't. There was something about her presence, her calmness, that unsettled him. "I don't need your help," Daniel snapped, his voice sharp. "I'm fine, I don't need anyone's pity." Mrs. Thompson didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze steady but kind. "I'm not here to pity you, Daniel. I'm here because I want to see you be the father Lily deserves. And right now, you're not that man." Daniel's face hardened, and for a moment the distance between them felt like an impenetrable wall. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her to leave him alone, but the words stuck in his throat. The shame he felt when he looked at his daughter, the guilt of failing her, was too much to put into words. It was easier to shut down, to remain numb, than to admit the truth of what he had become. But then as Daniel stood there, fists clenched, his thoughts swirling with frustration, a voice cut through the tension. It was a soft, trembling voice, one that carried the weight of a child's heartache. "Well, don't you love me anymore?" The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable as Lily appeared in the doorway. She had been standing just inside, overhearing the conversation between her father and Mrs. Thompson. She had been trying to hold it together, to stay quiet, but in that moment she couldn't hold back any longer. Her eyes, wide with a mix of confusion and pain, met Daniel's for the first time in what felt like ages. In that instant, the wall Daniel had built around himself cracked. His daughter's question, so simple, so pure, struck him like a physical blow. "Lily," Daniel began, his voice faltering, but he didn't know how to finish. How could he explain to her what had happened to him? How could he explain why he had become so distant, so cold? Lily stood there, her face streaked with tears, waiting for him to say something, anything. But there was nothing. The silence stretched out between them, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Thompson watched, her heart aching for both of them. This was the moment. Daniel had to see the depth of the pain he was causing, not just to himself, but to Lily, the one person who still loved him unconditionally. For the first time in months, Daniel's hardened exterior faltered. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the weight of his actions. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the fear, the confusion, and it was then that the realization hit him. He wasn't just failing as a man, he was failing as a father, and he couldn't run from it any longer. Mrs. Thompson had never been one to give up easily. She had watched enough families break apart over the years to know that, sometimes, intervention was the only way forward. She had been patient with Daniel, giving him space, allowing him time to confront his own demons. But she had also seen enough to know that if she didn't push him harder now, there might be no going back. After weeks of gentle persuasion, Daniel finally agreed to see a therapist. It wasn't an easy decision. He had resisted, arguing that he didn't need help. He had told Mrs. Thompson, told himself, that he was fine, that he could handle it on his own. But in the end, his pride was overruled by a simple truth. He could no longer avoid the toll his behavior had taken on his daughter. The strain in the house had become unbearable, and for Lily's sake, he knew he needed to try. But that didn't mean he was ready. Sitting in that therapist's office, Daniel felt like an outsider in his own skin. He was uncomfortable, stiff, his mind racing with doubts. He kept his arms crossed tightly across his chest, avoiding eye contact with the therapist, as if any sign of vulnerability would somehow reveal a weakness. The therapist, a calm woman in her mid-40s, tried to ease him into the conversation, but Daniel resisted every step of the way. "What brought you here today, Daniel?" she asked, her voice soft, patient. He stared at the floor, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice laced with the same frustration that had defined his days for months. "I'm just here because I have to be. It's not going to change anything." The therapist didn't push him. She simply nodded, as if she had heard it all before. "It's hard, Daniel, admitting that something's wrong, but I promise, you're not alone in this." He wanted to lash out, to leave, to prove to everyone, including himself, that he didn't need anyone's help. But deep down, he knew that this moment, this uncomfortable, painful moment, was a necessary part of the process. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to admit that he had failed. But he had no choice. The breakthrough didn't come during the therapy session. No, it came later, when Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen, a glass of whiskey in hand. The house was quiet, too quiet, and Lily was upstairs in her room. He could hear the soft murmur of the TV in the living room, a distant reminder of how much of their lives had been consumed by silence. Lily hadn't spoken to him much since their confrontation. She was still too hurt, too unsure of what her father was even capable of anymore. Daniel couldn't blame her. Every day it seemed like the distance between them grew wider. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words never came. The shame that had built up over the years was too heavy to lift. That night, as he poured the drink, something in him snapped. The weight of his failure, of everything he had ignored for so long, hit him all at once. He stumbled back into the living room and sank into the couch, the glass trembling in his hand. He closed his eyes, the pressure building in his chest. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to feel everything: the guilt, the frustration, the pain of knowing he had failed his daughter, the woman who once looked at him with admiration and love. He heard Lily's footsteps in the hallway, and before he could stop himself, the words were out. "Lily, I'm so sorry." Lily hesitated before entering, her face a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what's going on with you anymore. You don't even talk to me. You don't care about me, do you?" Daniel felt his heart break all over again. Her words, so raw and honest, struck him with an intensity that left him breathless. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he had become like this, why he had been so distant, but the words got tangled in his throat. How could he explain to her that he had been so lost in his own shame that he had forgotten how to be the father she needed? "I do care, Lily," he finally said, his voice cracking. "I love you, but I've been so afraid that I couldn't fix anything, that I couldn't be what you needed me to be. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Lily's eyes softened, but there was still a wariness there. She didn't trust him fully. She wanted to, but the scars of his absence, his emotional neglect, were deep. She didn't know if they could heal. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm scared." Daniel stood up then, the alcohol forgotten, his hands shaking as he reached out to her. "I'll do whatever it takes, Lily. I can't undo what I've done, but I'll try. I promise. I'll try." For the first time in months, Daniel felt something shift within him. It wasn't a complete resolution, not yet. But in that moment he knew that if he didn't make an effort to change, if he didn't truly fight for her, he might lose her forever. As the emotional weight of that moment lingered in the air, Richard's involvement became even more crucial. His return to the neighborhood had sparked a sense of hope in Daniel, though it had been a long time coming. Richard had seen firsthand how stubborn Daniel could be, how much he resisted help, and how impossible it was to break through to him when his pride was in the way. But now, something was different. One evening, Richard found Daniel in the kitchen, staring at an empty glass. He knew the weight of everything Daniel had been carrying. The past few weeks had been difficult for both of them, but Richard was determined to be there. "You're not alone, you know," Richard said quietly, his voice rough from the unspoken words they both had been avoiding. Daniel didn't respond at first, his eyes downcast. But after a long pause he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this, Rich. I don't know how to make it right." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze softening. "You don't have to do it alone, Dan. We'll get through this together." The two brothers sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the stirrings of something, hope, however small, beginning to take root. It wasn't going to be easy. Healing never was. But with Richard by his side, with Lily's forgiveness still in the balance, Daniel knew he had a chance. Daniel's first few weeks of therapy were rocky, to say the least. Every session felt like an exhausting struggle. Each word, each admission seemed like a mountain too steep to climb. He found himself second-guessing every step, unsure of what he was supposed to be saying, what was truly important. But as the sessions went on, something in him began to shift. Slowly, very slowly, he started to open up. The first breakthrough came when Daniel found himself talking about his childhood, a time when things hadn't seemed so difficult, when he had felt like he could conquer anything. He spoke about the pride he had taken in building his business, about the early days of being a father, when everything felt so promising. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Evans, didn't rush him, didn't push too hard. Instead, she gave him space to reflect on his past and how it had shaped him. "Tell me about a time when you felt most alive," Dr. Evans asked him during one of their sessions. The question felt like an anchor, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to look back, not with shame but with a sense of pride. He spoke about his early days in business, the excitement of launching something new, the joy of seeing his hard work pay off. He remembered the day Lily was born, the overwhelming love he felt as he held her in his arms for the first time. As Daniel began to unravel the layers of his past, he realized just how much of it he had buried. The shame, the failure, the guilt, it had all clouded his memories. But as he spoke, the weight began to lift, even if only slightly. The road to healing between Daniel and Lily was never going to be easy. The trust that had been eroded by months, maybe even years of emotional neglect, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But Daniel was determined to try, even when it felt like he was failing again. In the quiet moments after therapy, Daniel would sit in Lily's room, watching her draw or read. At first, there was an awkwardness between them, a distance that couldn't be easily crossed. Lily would glance up at him every now and then, but her expression was guarded, uncertain. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again. After all, he had been so absent for so long, both physically and emotionally. But Daniel knew that showing up was the first step. He started small, asking her about her day, really listening when she spoke. They would sit together on the couch, and Daniel would share stories from his own childhood, making her laugh with memories of his younger years. Slowly, their conversations began to take root. For the first time in a long while, Lily began to feel seen. Daniel's effort to be present, to open up about his own struggles, allowed Lily to start healing too. "I'm sorry for not being there for you," Daniel said one evening, his voice shaky but sincere. "I should have been more present. I should have listened. I was just so lost. But I'm here now. I want to be here for you, Lily." Lily didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, her eyes softening as the weight of his words settled between them. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Daniel didn't feel like a failure as a father. He felt like he had a chance to get it right. The days started to feel different. The tension in the house, while still present, was no longer as suffocating. There were quiet moments when Daniel and Lily simply sat together, not speaking, but feeling the comfort of each other's presence. Lily started to spend more time outside again, reconnecting with her friends and regaining the confidence she had lost. It wasn't just her outward behavior that was changing. It was the way she carried herself. The vulnerability that had once weighed her down was starting to lift. One morning, Daniel walked out to the porch to find Lily sitting on the swing in the front yard, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The sun had just risen, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood. Daniel approached slowly, his heart swelling with pride as he saw her smile, the first genuine smile he had seen in months. "You ready for school?" Daniel asked, leaning against the porch rail. Lily looked up at him, her eyes brighter than they had been in a long time. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready." They walked to school together, side by side, and for the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel so heavy. They talked along the way, small talk about school, about the things Lily had learned. It was easy, it felt natural. It felt like the beginning of something new. As they reached the school gates, Daniel paused, looking down at his daughter. She was standing a little taller, her shoulders a little straighter. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "And I love you." Lily looked up at him, her expression soft. "I love you too, Dad." The words were simple, but they held more weight than Daniel could have imagined. They weren't just words. They were a promise to be there, to be present, to rebuild everything they had lost. Mrs. Thompson, who had watched them from her window, smiled quietly to herself. She had seen them walking together that morning, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The neighborhood had rallied around them, offering small gestures of kindness, checking in, offering help, just being there for them in ways that only a close-knit community could. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Just as things seemed to be looking up, Daniel received a call that would change everything. It was a job offer, a turning point he hadn't expected. It came from an old business associate, someone Daniel had worked with years ago. The offer wasn't a return to the grand business venture he had once dreamed of, but it was something more important, a second chance. It wasn't much at first, just a small consulting role, but it was the first step back into the world he had once loved. Daniel stood in the living room, the phone still in his hand, as the weight of the offer settled in. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He wasn't back to where he had once been, but he had a sense of direction again. He had a purpose, and that purpose was to be the father Lily needed, and to rediscover the man he had once been. Lily walked into the room just as Daniel hung up. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Daniel smiled, a real smile that stretched across his face. "I just got a job offer," he said. "A chance to start over. It's not much, but it's a start." Lily's eyes brightened. "That's great, Dad." It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep moving forward. Together, they had begun to heal, and Daniel knew that with the right support, both from Lily and his community, he could rebuild not just his career, but his relationship with his daughter. As they stood together in the middle of the living room, Daniel realized that redemption wasn't about returning to the person he once was, it was about becoming the person he was meant to be. And in that moment, he knew he had a chance to do just that.